have another excellent free pattern for you today. This is the Violet Pinafore dress by Tiana's Closet. This pinafore is beautifully lined with a continuous lining around the armholes, the neckline, and the back invisible zipper for a professionally finished and polished look. The outer material that I'm using in this video is a semi-stretch cotton denim from Rex Fabrics. If you'd like to ensure a seamless look between your lining and outer material, I would recommend a lining fabric that's the same color as your outer. I love how this pattern also gives you the opportunity to grab a couple buttons from your stash that you've been dying to show off and display them on the front pockets. Take your time with this project and you'll get beautiful results. I hope you join me. Let's get started. For the top edges of both of our pockets, we're going to cut 5/8 inch wide strips of interfacing to fuse to those top edges. Then I'm going to finish the edges all the way around for both pockets. Now that those edges are finished, I'll take the pockets to the ironing board and press the interfaced edges to the wrong side, and also press the side and bottom edges to the wrong side by 1/2 inch. On my front dress piece, I've transferred my pocket markings from the pattern piece. Now I'll place the wrong side of the pocket at the top corners at those pin markings and pin the pocket in place along the side and bottom edges. Then I'll top stitch the pocket in place, edge stitching close to the side and bottom edges. And additionally, you can add a second row of top stitching 1/4 inch away from the side edges, back stitching at both top corners to secure, and repeat for both pockets. Place both sets of pocket flaps right sides together and pin the side and top edges. Sew the side and top edges with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, leaving this bottom edge open for now. Then we can trim the seam allowances and clip the corners. And then we can turn the flaps right side out, poking out the corners. And if you'd like your buttons to be functional instead of decorative, you can add buttonholes. I'm going to add some interfacing inside of the flaps at the center. Then I'll mark the centers of my flaps with chalk. And I'll sew buttonholes in place away from this bottom sewn edge. And then I'll open up the buttonholes. Then I'll line up the raw edge of my flap with the top of my pocket and pin in place. And then we'll sew that flap in place with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Repeating for both pockets. Trim those seam allowances. Fold your flaps down along the stitching line and give them a good press. Then we can top stitch the top of that pocket flap in place, doing that for both flaps. Now for both of my front pieces, I'm going to finish the center and side seams separately. Also doing this for both back pieces and for the center and side edges of your front and back lining pieces. Now place your front pieces right sides together and pin the center front seam, and repeat for your front lining pieces. Then sew these center front seams with a 1/2 inch seam allowance and press the seams open. Now I'll place my front and back pieces right sides together at the shoulder seams and pin in place. And then I'll also pin both of the side seams. Then we'll sew both of the side seams and both of the shoulder seams with a 1/2 inch seam allowance and press the seams open. And repeat to put together the main garment. Here are my front and back main pieces opened out at the shoulder seam. so the right sides of the front and back pieces are facing me. Place your lining and your main right sides together along the neckline, and we'll pin in place from the center back all around the neckline to the opposite center back. Then I'll open up my invisible zipper and take it to the ironing board to press open those coils. Now I'm going to place the right side of my zipper onto the wrong side of the lining. And I'll take the zipper tape that's closest to this center back, place the top edge in between the lining and the main fabric. I want the top zipper stop to be 1/2 inch away from the top raw edge of the garment, and I want the distance between the finished edge of my center back and the teeth of the zipper to be 3/4 inch. I'll pin that in place. And repeat on the other side. Once again, placing the right side of the zipper with the right side of the center back. The teeth of the zipper are facing the inside of the garment, and sandwich that edge between the lining and the main. Now I'm going to sew the neckline starting at one center back edge with a 3/8 inch seam allowance, catching the top of the zipper as I go, pivoting around that center V and stopping my stitching at the top edge of the opposite center back, once again catching the top of the zipper. Now I'm going to take sharp scissors and clip into the V in the front bodice to but not through the stitching line. And also trim some of the seam allowance here to reduce bulk. Then I'm going to continue clipping into the seam allowance for the curves of the neckline. Now we're going to understitch. Press that seam allowance toward the lining and stitch the seam allowance to the lining about 1/8 inch away from the original stitching line. As you're understitching and you approach the center V, stitch as far as you can, backstitch to secure, and then start a new set of understitching on the opposite side of the center V, again backstitching to secure, until you've understitched your way back to the opposite center back. Now that the neckline is understitched, turn the main and lining right side out and give that neckline a good press. Now we're going to start working on sewing the armholes. I'm going to be sewing the armholes in 2 stages. First, I'll sew the back of the armhole from underarm seam to shoulder seam. I'll turn my seam allowances to the inside and hold that in place. Then I'll reach in between the main and lining fabric to grab that seam allowance that I pressed under. And I'll follow that seam allowance down to the underarm. So now with my underarm seams right sides together, I'll pin in place and continue pinning to the shoulder seam. Now that the material is right sides together from underarm to shoulder, I'll sew as pinned with a 3/8 inch seam allowance, backstitching at both seams to secure. So now we have the first half of that armhole finished. And we're going to sew the lining and main of the front section together in the same way. First, tucking the seam allowances inside, holding that in place, and then placing your hand in between the main and lining fabrics to grab those seam allowances. And then pin those sections together just as we did on the other side. The fabric will fight you a little bit as you're trying to gain access into that strap. Tug that fabric a little bit, making sure you're keeping everything right sides together, and you'll be fine. Now we can sew this second section from underarm to shoulder seam with a 3/8 inch seam allowance, backstitching at both sides to secure. Now that armhole is fully lined and we can understitch. We're going to press that seam allowance toward the lining And just as we did for the neckline, we're going to sew the seam allowance to the lining with 1/8 of an inch seam allowance, stitching as far as you can get up into those shoulders, all the way around the armhole. Now we've finished this armhole, you can give it a press and repeat all of those steps to complete your opposite armhole. Now that the armholes are finished, we can complete the center back zipper. Place your lining and main fabric right sides together once again. And we're going to pin that zipper in place in between the lining and main from the top to the bottom of the zipper tape, making sure once again that the distance between the outer edge and your zipper teeth is 3/4 of an inch. Then using a zipper foot or an invisible zipper foot, sew that zipper in between the lining and the main, feeling in between the fabric to ensure that the needle is getting as close to the zipper teeth as possible. Sewing from the top to as far as your presser foot will allow you to get to the bottom of the zipper. So now I have 1/2 of the zipper installed. Repeat the process on the other side to place this zipper tape in between the main and lining fabrics. And pin that side of the zipper in place, and then sew this side in place close to those zipper teeth to as far as your presser foot will allow you to get to the bottom of the zipper. Now my zipper is installed, and we're going to complete that center back seam. First, we'll place the main back pieces only right sides together, and pin them together from where the stitching for the zipper stopped to the bottom of the garment. Then using my zipper foot for the first few stitches to get my needle as close to where my zipper stitches stopped, sew a few stitches and then switch back to my regular foot to complete the remainder of the seam with a 3/4 inch seam allowance. And then you can press that seam open. Then we'll repeat the same exact steps to complete the lining seam. Sewing from the end of our initial zipper stitching to the bottom of the lining garment, in the same exact way as the main fabric, and then press that seam allowance open. The hem allowance for the bottom of the garment is 1 inch, both for the main fabric and the lining. I've chosen to simply finish the raw edges all the way around for both pieces and press that hem to the wrong side by 1 inch all the way around. Once again, doing that for both pieces. Now I'll sew close to my finishing stitches all the way around to finish the garment. The last step is to add your buttons. I'm going to add jean buttons. Through the buttonhole, I'm going to mark where I want the button to go. Then I'll poke holes at those markings using an awl. Place the screw underneath. And then hammer those buttons onto the screws. Give everything a nice final press and your Pinafore dress is complete. Thank you for watching this sew along. Make sure you subscribe to the channel so you don't miss notifications every time a new full-length sewing tutorial comes out. And I'll see you in the next video.